Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon to our friends who are watching us on YouTube, and to those of you who are here virtually. We welcome you to the 5th Annual Henry and Annabel Larzelere Memorial Lecture. We are so grateful for so many things today. First of all, of course, for Henry and Annabel, who provided models for us of ways to engage with the world through their support of People's Church, through their involvement in civic activities, through their involvement in the world, and we're so pleased to be able to honor them in this way. All three of their children are here today. I'm going to ask them to stand up. John, my husband, Mary Dygert, child number 2, and third child, Marty Campbell, who lives in Venice, Florida, and fortunately, she could join us today. So we're grateful for People's Church and the way that they have supported this and been so instrumental in the thinking of Henry and Annabel and what it meant to them to be involved in the world. Especially thankful to our committee, Mike and the Reverend Penny Swartz, Carol and Sandy Grayson, and our minister, dear Shawnthea Monroe. So we're thankful for that committee. And they've been on, except for Shawnthea, they've been with us for the whole time when this original idea started. Of course, we're thankful for your presence, the fact that you're here with us today. And we're especially thankful for Shannon Craigo-Snell, who is here with us today and was brought to us by Shawnthea. As you know, if you were here for the sermon, that they're best friends, and Shawnthea said, this is the person we need to have for this lecture. So we welcome you, and we're so glad that you're here. And finally, we just want you to enjoy today and perhaps find some encouragement, some inspiration for the next steps that you want to take to be the church in the world as you listen to this speaker today. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary Ann. I'm Shawnthea Monroe. I am the senior pastor here at the People's Church, and it is a delight and a privilege for me to be given the task to welcome and introduce our speaker. This last week, I was giving a presentation on Zoom with a bunch of ministers, and I was speaking about the craft and task of preaching. And one of the questions I was asked was, how do you maintain your love of preaching, and also how do you keep getting better at the craft of preaching? And I said the key is to have a best friend who is a theologian. Because my friendship with Shannon Craigo-Snell, which dates back to the very first day of seminary, is the thing that has kept my theological mind sharp and my preaching heart alive. One of the things I appreciate about Shannon is not only is she one of the finest minds who's teaching in the area of theology, trained at Yale, not only for an MDiv, but also a PhD, but she is someone who believes, as I do, that theology is best when it hits the life of the people. It is an embodied faith that we have, and that anything she does lands on the ground eventually. She has lately written a book on how to be an ally, but she has many more books to her name, and so the fact that she's talking today about racism and faith, that's because this is the topic that she feels is most pressing. But she could, with great aplomb and talent, talk about many other issues having to do with the Christian faith. We are so delighted to have Shannon Craigo-Snell as our 5th annual Larzelere speaker. One note, if you are watching online, you are invited to engage in the question answers at the end. If you are able to write in the chat, I will be monitoring that, and we will be sure to share your question. Otherwise, at the end, raise your hand and I will bring the microphone around so that we can engage in it back and forth. I hope you will join me in welcoming Reverend Dr. Shannon Craigo-Snell.
Hello, hello. So, Shawnthea's description of why she's important to have a best friend who's a pastor. If I stray too far from the ground, from what actually matters in churches, she said, wait a minute, don't forget you work for me. So let's start with a prayer. God of grace, grant us curiosity and wisdom, comfort and challenge. We give thanks for this day, for this community of people eager to learn, eager to draw closer to you. And we ask that you be present with us in this time. Amen. So, Shawnthea invited you to ask questions at the end. That's great. But I'm going to ask you to ask questions at any point. If I say something that doesn't make sense, or I left out the verb, or you disagree with, or you're not quite sure, just holler. Raise your hand, and it's more fun if we're conversing and I'm lecturing. So I'm a theologian and I'm a Presbyterian. And while this is true for all Christians, the Reformed traditions really hammer it home, that all theology begins with grace. We start with the grace of God. Any other starting point is too far from home. My understanding of the grace of God is that it is a gift from God given to us, and it's a particular gift of vocation. It is a calling of who we are to be, that God lays a claim on us before we're born and draws us towards God's self. And that vocation, that who we are meant to be, is something we all know well. We are to love God and neighbor. That's the whole deal. And so grace, as I understand it, is God's gift of that identity. This is who you are. You are a person called to love God and neighbor. And that vocation, drawing us constantly into that love. So the idea of loving God and neighbor reveals God's intent for us, God's invitation to us, our vocation, and it's also a command. When the grace comes with force, you are to love God and neighbor, and a promise that that is really who we are, and it is really who God gives to us. So, if our goal, if who we are is to love God and neighbor, then it matters when our neighbors are in trouble, and we need to pay attention. In the United States right now, our neighbors are in trouble. Now, there are different neighbors in different kinds of trouble, but one of the big things, one of the things that's most pressing in this moment is the trouble of racism. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. As Shawnthea mentioned, I have multiple degrees in very highfalutin things, but what I'm going to talk about right now are things I should have learned in high school, but I didn't. And I'm maybe you did. There's some great schools in this neighborhood. But just in case. So I'm going to start with the very basics of terminology. We all have internal biases, right? So in the United States, most of us have an internal bias that says tall men are better leaders. So we look to Neil. Show us the way. Now, it's completely ridiculous. No offense, Neil. But tall men are not better leaders than others, but we have that bias. You can go online and take all kinds of interesting tests that will tell you what kind of biases you have that you don't even know you have. That's bias. Bigotry is when a person, an individual person, takes those biases and says, no, I believe this. I think that stereotype is right. I I think tall men are the only people worth following. There's a short guy in front of you, you turn around and walk the other way. Racism is different than that. Racism isn't about what's happening inside an individual's heart or mind or stomach or anything. Racism is systemic and structural. So I'm going to give you a metaphor for this that I find really illuminating. It's a metaphor developed by a man named Chris Dussault, who is an activist and a teacher. I come to you today from Louisville, Kentucky. How many of you have been to Louisville at some point in your life? Great. Then you'll know what I'm talking about. Louisville is a city built for cars. There's some public transportation, there are buses, but it's sketchy. The schedules are not very convenient. There are long spaces in between bus stops. And in Louisville, if 2 flakes of snow fall, the buses just stop. You know, snow removal in the city of Louisville is 2 guys in a hairdryer. I mean, there's not much going on there. So if any snow starts falling, they just stop. Lots of places don't have sidewalks. So the city is really built for people who have cars, and where the electricity lines are, where the sewer lines are, where the water lines are, where the grocery stores are all based on cars. Kroger won't put in a store unless there's a certain amount of parking, which means most of the Krogers are outside the center of the city, right? So it's a car city, which doesn't mean that those of us who have cars are driving around going, woo-hoo, look at me, I've got a car, life is good. I'm in the car and I'm thinking, who is this idiot in front of me and why are they driving so slow? Why is that light on again? That light on saying that my tire is low, I just filled the tire. I'm worried about my teenager who's about to get his license and how much my insurance will go up. I'm not thinking driving a car is the best thing ever. But I'm also not noticing just how hard it would be to get around the city if I didn't have one. I don't notice that there aren't sidewalks. I don't notice that all the bike lanes are in the parks for recreation, not to get to the dentist. I don't notice just how difficult it would be if I didn't have a vehicle. And if I do notice, I might say, well, you know, I don't think this city really should be a car city. So I might decide I want to bike or I want to walk to work. If I walk to work, that's going to be great for my calf muscles, might be good for my lungs, will not change a thing about how the city is built. Won't matter. The concrete is already there. My deciding individually to use a different means of transportation doesn't change it. Everybody with me? Louisville is a city built for cars. The United States is a country built for white people. In the same way that Louisville, what happens in it today is structured by the way the concrete is poured. Racism is poured in the concrete of the United States. From the very beginning of the colonizing of this country, white people were the ones it was built for. With me? Okay. Now I'm going to talk about how we got here. And again, this is stuff I didn't learn until remarkably late in my life, embarrassingly late in my life. I grew up in a small town in West Virginia, and I thought that being black or white, I don't think I knew there was any other racial category other than black or white, was just a given. It was something you were born with. It was just a fact, like having blue eyes or brown eyes. It just came. You just came that way. People naturally came in races. That's not actually true. People have always come in lots of different shades of skin tone, lots of different eye colors, hair textures, lots of different appearances. The word is phenotype, lots of different ways of being in terms of how they look. But race is something we invented roughly 500 years ago. The whole category of race is made up. Is this familiar to folks? Yeah, we got some folks who went to good schools here, probably here in Michigan. So before colonization, you had lots of small groups that named themselves. We are the Cherokee, we are the Seneca, we are the Craigos of Manila Creek, whatever. And the grouping, it was a self-identification of a tribe or people based on things like the language they spoke, the way they dressed, the music they made, the way they worshiped, how they got food. Did they fish? Did they hunt? What did they do? And those individual peoples define themselves. And they always fought with each other. You know, we read in the Bible, the Hittites fight the Moabites or whatever. And it's partly geographical, like we're the Craigos of Manila Creek, that's where my people come from. But it's also about all these other things, the language, the religion, the music, the art. So then, all that's going along. But in roughly the 1500s, you had started to be a lot of movement. And different people from Europe got in a ship, or several ships, and they, go across the ocean, and they end up in Africa. And Africa, first of all, if you think about the globe, it's really big. And there are so many different kinds of people who live in Africa, so many different languages spoken, so many different religions. You got the tallest people in the world in Africa and the shortest people in the world in Africa. You've got black-skinned, black-eyed folks and pale-skinned, blue-eyed folks in Africa. But the folks who'd come from Europe and set foot, they said, all these people are black. And that was at the same time that they said, and we are white. Right, so I grew up thinking that race was just a given, like having blue eyes or brown eyes or green eyes. And that somehow humanity had messed up because we started using it to say some people were less good than others. But the truth of the matter is, the very concept of race was invented in order to exploit people. There has never been a moment of race without racism. With me? Comments? Questions? Yes?
I'm having trouble hearing you. I'm sorry. I know. Anybody else? Turn up a notch. Move the microphone up a little bit.
Yeah, feedback a little hum. Is that better?
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
Much better.
Both of you.
All right. Any other questions? That was a really important question. So this similar group of Europeans get in another boat and they go over. Hold on. No one else is going across the ocean. I'm going to stop making that motion. Yeah. no problem.
Well, you're a good wanderer.
I'm a good wanderer.
She wanders well, but I have a better mic. Okay, dear, I'm switching over to mine.
I'm sorry for the interruption, but
No,
I couldn't hear.
that's really incredibly helpful. It's much nicer when the person doing this is someone you know.
I've taught in a lot of churches where it's, Stan is trying to put something in the back of my pants. So a similar pattern happened with European colonists coming to what would become the Americas. All these different tribes, all these different languages, and they say, you are all Indians. And it was a naming that was external, and it was based on, it came with, you are Indian, you are not white, therefore it's okay if we take your land. And the biggest groups to say it's okay if you don't to take the land were churches. The doctrine of discovery was the official doctrine of the Catholic Church that said European colonizers could come to the Americas, and anyone that wasn't converted to Christianity could be enslaved or murdered. And that was fine. God gave the stamp of approval on that. And that was the Catholics, but the Protestants weren't any better. So, the United States was, from the beginning, built as a country by those European colonizers, settlers, whatever we're calling them. It was built for them. The concrete was poured for their benefit at the expense of black and brown people. Now, I want to tell you about Bacon's Rebellion. How many of you have learned about this before? We've got some definite good schools here, well-educated congregation. I didn't know about this until an embarrassingly late age. But in 1676, when the social construction of race was still fragile, right? This was a new thing. People didn't take it as a given yet. Some of the folks in Virginia were like, why are there a handful of rich European people running things? That doesn't seem fair. And so poor white folks, indentured servants, indentured African servants, not all black people were enslaved at the time, and some Native Americans got together to overthrow the government, led by a guy whose last name was Bacon. And they did it. It was successful. They burned down the governor's mansion. They acted in solidarity, and they took over. It, of course, lasted for approximately a minute and a half because the English just sent people with troops, and Bacon's Rebellion was put down. But the folks in charge learned their lesson. If poor people across demographic lines band together in solidarity, they can kick us out. We won't be in control. I feel like this is the key to American politics since then. So in response to the Bacon's Rebellion, led by Nathaniel Bacon in 1676, the racial divisions were codified in the law of the colonies for the first time. For the very first time, the words white and black were written into the laws of this coming to be country. And it was definitely, clearly, a way for the wealthy to exert social control over the poor. This makes so much sense to me. As I said, I'm from small town West Virginia. Before the 2016 election, my people in small town West Virginia got really, really worried and upset about Mexican immigrants. There are maybe 5 Mexican immigrants in West Virginia, and we're really glad to have them because we've had population decline for decades. Why were they upset? But they were being told. Poor white people, the folks you really need to worry about are poor Mexican people, poor Hispanic folks, poor black folks. The wealthy white people are your friends. So that mindset is at the base of our politics. When, just in 1680, just soon after Bacon's Rebellion, the slave codes were written. Between 1680 and 1682. These said that anyone black is necessarily a slave, that black people could not congregate without a white person, that black and white people could not be together, could not intermarry, could not spend time together. All of the horrors of slavery were encoded into law in response to Bacon's Rebellion. Comments? Question? That's the beginning of the pouring of the concrete. This is how we're going to make this nation. And this nation is going to rest upon the foundation of races that must be separated. So then we had the Civil War. Yeah, I'm skipping 300 years there. But then we had the Civil War. Cool, right? And I learned something about the Civil War in my high school education. What I didn't really learn about was Reconstruction. That after slavery was made illegal, the force of the federal government was put behind the effort to equalize the situations of blacks and whites in the South. So there were federal troops in the South that could prevent harm to, racial hate crimes. Let's go with modern language for it. There were freedmen's bureaus that were dedicated to improving the lot of recently freed, formerly enslaved persons. And the thing of it is, it worked. In just about a decade of Reconstruction, the situation for black folks in the South changed so dramatically. During the 1870s, over 2,000 black men were elected to office, including 16 to Congress. It was amazing. Once the federal government had a will to do this and put some energy behind it, it was wildly successful. It ended 10 years later. There was a dispute about who had won the presidency. Had we counted the votes right? Was there some sort of fraud? And in the backroom negotiations about who would be recognized as president, the decision was made, we'll recognize this president if you end Reconstruction. Get the federal troops out of the South, end the freedmen's bureaus, we'll take it from here. Sound familiar? So that's when the black codes were written, which are more familiar as Jim Crow laws. I don't know if you've ever read all of them, but they're astonishing. You could be arrested for vagrancy. You are standing around if you didn't have a job, you could be arrested for that. Black people could be arrested for learning to read and write, for assembling without a white person present, for living in white communities. And get this one is, so many women were employed cleaning the houses or raising the babies of white folks. And part of the Jim Crow laws were that a black person employed in the home of a white person could not leave that home without permission. How is that different from slavery? How is that different? And of course, we all know black people couldn't vote. Now, very few of the black people who were arrested for violating the black codes went to prison. Instead, their sentences were sold to mines and brickyards and farms. And so they were right back in captivity and unpaid labor. That was enforced from 1877 to 1950, or all the way up to 1950, by lynchings. I'm so sorry to have to remind you of this history that you do know. But during that period of time, 4,000 black men, women, and children were lynched. Lynching technically refers to when a group of people or someone is killed outside of legal recourse. The truth of it is more than that. This was when someone would decide that a black person needed killing. And in Kentucky, we still have the advertisements from where it was put in the paper. In 2 weeks, we are going to kill XXX, whatever the name. Come, y'all come. And church communities came and had their picnics. And the person who was being lynched would be tortured, tormented. Often men would have their genitalia cut off. Often people would be burned. Ultimately, they would, for the most part, be hung. Photographers would come and take family portraits, you know, the Smith family underneath the limb with the hanging man. They would make postcards and sell them. They would take bits of the body and sell them as souvenirs. This was completely acceptable up until the 1950s. The folks who lynched were not taken to court. They were not judged for killing. And the people that they killed, the point wasn't really to kill Emmett Till or to kill any other person. The point was to remind the whole community that white people could kill black people with impunity. It was to remind black people that their lives didn't matter, that at any moment they could be killed for sport. It was to remind them that this country was built for white people. Comments? Queasiness? Ready to vomit? Yeah, Mary.
I have a question. Who was the president that was chosen in place of the...
I almost said it out loud, and then I couldn't. Rutherford B. Hayes. And it's wrapped up in the Electoral College and how we ended up with that, because we've apparently always been fighting over whether or not an election was, was settled. Any other comments, questions? It's very depressing in here. I started with grace, but then we went straight to hell. So, the social construct of race was still being negotiated, right? It's a really big thing to convince an entire people that this idea they made up last week is just a given. And so courts, US courts, were still negotiating if someone was white or not up until 1923. There is an incredible article by Cheryl Harris in the Harvard Law Review called "Whiteness as Property" that blew my mind. Again, from small town West Virginia, lots of poor people, and people always say, oh, they're voting for Republicans. They're voting against their self-interest. Well, the folks I grew up with aren't dumb. Are they really voting against their self-interest? Cheryl Harris argues, looking at the legal cases, that whiteness is a financial asset. That if someone said you were black, suddenly you couldn't go to school, you couldn't get a job. If you got a job, you got a lot less money, and oh my goodness, you could be lynched. Whereas if you were black and someone said you were white, well then, great. Whiteness is a financial asset. And for a lot of poor white folks in the United States, it might be the most valuable one they have. And so someone who's talking about racial equality is threatening their finances. Does that make sense? Just fascinating to me. I'd never thought of that. So, as the courts were trying to legalize and make clear who was Chinese, who was Indian from the country of India, who was a Native American, who was black, who was white, who would get the benefits of this country. There were lots of attempts to make it scientific, and all of that is a farce. You know, we made this up. There's no scientific difference. Yes, you can say, oh, this person has a particular phenotype, but we're all genetically the same. In 1924, they passed the Racial Integrity Act, which some of you might recognize as the one-drop rule. That a person is considered black if they have 1 drop of black blood. But it doesn't work the other way around, because whiteness was seen as purity and blackness as defilement. Just reminding you of some of the ways this was poured into the concrete. So then we had the Great Depression. I am doing a caricature of American history here. Just run with me. Don't tell other scholars that I go this fast through the history of the United States. In the 1930s, in order to try and help people recover from the Great Depression, the legislatures passed the New Deal. And to this day, Democrats consider the New Deal the pinnacle of achievement. And in many ways it was. There's all this talk of a Green New Deal. We need to do that kind of thing again. The New Deal was actually a group of laws, innovations, one of which was FHA loans. So before the New Deal, if you wanted to buy a house, you had to put 50% of the price of the house down and then pay the rest off in 5 years. So basically, you had to have the money for the house up front. So many people lost their homes during the Great Depression, the government said, okay, how can we fix this? How can we help get people into houses? And they said, I got it. We will back mortgages. The federal government will back mortgages, and we'll make them 30-year mortgages. So you put down 20% and you've got 30 years to pay the rest. Well, suddenly home ownership is open to whole swaths of people that it was never open to before. But before they gave a loan, a single one, they sent people into every town in the United States to say, where's the neighborhood that's a good financial bet for the government? Where's the neighborhood worth buying a home in? And they, honest to goodness, took a red line and went through every town and marked where the white people live. And they supported the loans in those neighborhoods, but not in black and brown neighborhoods. In Louisville, Kentucky, you can walk to this day and see where the line was. And I bet you could here. I bet you can find the street where that line was. Between 1934 and 1962, the federal government guaranteed $120 billion in mortgages. 98% of that money went to white people. Now, I'd love to talk to you about this so much more, because home ownership is a really big deal. That was the biggest wealth building program ever created in the United States. And pre-pandemic, it was still the case, and it flows out into all these other things. Lead poisoning. You're more likely to get lead poisoning if you rent an apartment than if you own your own home. So that goes into behavioral stuff in schools and IQ levels, all these different things. Before the pandemic, the vast majority of first-time homeowners in the United States were able to purchase that first home because their parents helped them out with the down payment. So the fact that great-grandparents were given help by the federal government to buy a home meant that great-grandchildren could too. And we keep having more than 2 babies for families. And so instead of this problem decreasing over time, it snowballs into massive wealth inequality in the United States today. Now, the people who came up with the New Deal were not evil meanies twirling their mustaches. These were good people trying hard to figure out how to help folks have a place to live and sleep at night. But they were products of their time. And all that money went to white people. And we still reap the benefits. In my continuing sprint through American history, let's get to 1944. Oh, one more thing in the Green New Deal. Social Security. Social Security is the biggest poverty-reducing program the U.S. has ever enacted, and the categories of workers who could receive Social Security excluded domestic workers and farm workers. So Social Security for the first several decades went primarily to white people and not to people of color. 1944, you've got the GI Bill. Now, there was no federal law saying that it had to go to white people, but the federal government relied on local officials to dole out the money. Historians argue that it was more racially distinct and arguably more cruel than the New Deal was. Because for the vast majority of the money of the GI Bill went only to white people. Now, how many of you in your families, there's someone you know that you've been related to who's benefited from a 30-year mortgage, an FHA-backed loan, or the GI Bill? It's so widespread. Another jump through history, 1971. Richard Nixon declares drugs public enemy number 1. I'm going to give you a quote from John Ehrlichman. Some of you will, maybe everyone here will remember who that was. He was a member of the Nixon administration. I'm going to read this slowly because I find it so astonishing. This was years later. He was interviewed. He said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had 2 enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt these communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Nixon's war on drugs moves right into mass incarceration, to the school-to-prison pipeline. The height of the prison population in the United States was in the late 1990s. And at that point in time, there were more Black Americans imprisoned, under confinement, doing unpaid labor for free. That's redundant. Doing unpaid labor than there had been at the height of slavery. And if you here in Michigan went to Whole Foods to buy some lettuce, it was probably grown by incarcerated Black men. Our society is built for white people. It's poured into the concrete. Those are the systems that keep it going. It's not about what we think about people of color or white people. It's not about what we feel. It's not about using the N-word. It's about how the concrete is poured. And if we don't like how it's poured, then it's going to take more than thoughts and prayers to change it. We're going to have to get some jackhammers going to tear up the concrete. What are you thinking now? Tell me your response to hearing this shamefully quick dash through American history.
It's not portrayed frequently enough or deep enough. If at all, it's glossed over.
Right. And right now there are school boards across the country that are trying to enact regulation that means it can't be. You might have seen in the news recently, there's this big hubbub about critical race theory. First of all, critical race theory is being taught in graduate programs and law schools, not elementary school. But under that umbrella, they talk about this unpatriotic depiction of American history. And across the country, groups are trying to make it illegal to tell this story. And in Texas, they enact some community, I don't remember, it was in the newspaper just the last couple days, the school board made a rule that you had to show both sides. And it came to national attention when a teacher teaching about the Holocaust was told that they needed to tell the other side of the story. The way that racism lives is by us not talking about it. Because that concrete is going to be there. And if we don't tear it up, it will continue. And you know what happens when concrete starts to crumble? We fix it. We repair it just the way it was. I learned how to start repairing the concrete when I was way too young to understand what it meant. I was being a good citizen and learning the history and imbibing all the ways in which racism keeps going. Any other comments, questions? Anyone really depressed yet?
Can I get a jackhammer?
Oh yeah, good. There are people who sell them right here in town. Before we get to the buying of jackhammers, I want to go back to theology and say that it's really hard for white people like myself to talk about racism and to hear about it, because it makes me, physically my body hurts. Is your body hurting from hearing about lynching? Right, your body hurts. Your mind reels, your heart breaks. It's hard to hear about it. And a lot of us, our first response is to be defensive and say, I'm not racist. I've never said the N-word. I treat everybody just the same. My parents taught me to treat everybody just the same. But that kind of misses the point, because it isn't about our individual thoughts or feelings. It's about the concrete. There's a whole different side of things, of white people who are very involved in talking about racism, who talk about how we're complicit. White people are complicit in racism because we benefit from it. And I kind of reject that too. I'm like, I didn't choose this. What are you talking about? In the United States, we tend to think in terms of innocence and guilt. Either I'm innocent of racism because I didn't say the words or build anything, or I'm complicit. I'm guilty of racism just by virtue of being white. But those categories don't really work. Guilt and innocence are categories for individuals. We understand guilt and innocence primarily through the penal system, right? The justice system. And for a person to be innocent, for a person to be guilty, they had to have freely chosen to do something when they had other options, right? I didn't freely choose to benefit from racism. For a person to be innocent, they had to really not be a part of it. I am a part of it. So innocence and guilt are they're really terms for individuals. And racism isn't an individual thing. Now the good news is that we have really great language for this. We have just the thing to talk about racism. And that is the language of grace, which I mentioned earlier, and the language of sin. Now, in a lot of lefty white churches, I'm speaking of Presbyterian world here, and not Reformed Church of America kind of Presbyterians, PCUSA kind of Presbyterians, we don't want to talk about sin, because we know how that language has been weaponized against the LGBTQ community. And so we kind of don't want to use that language anymore. Then there are other denominations that don't really want to use that language because it's just kind of a downer. But sin is actually a complex, nuanced idea that helps explain long-term generational injustice. So now I'm going to talk to you about sin and give you a really old school definition. You with me? So there are several words in the Bible that are translated as sin. One of them means literally missing the mark. So if we think about grace as a vocation to love God and neighbor, that's what we're called to, that's what we're aiming for, then sin is whenever we get off the path. Sin is both a state we're in and a thing we do. And the terms for that, I'm going really old school, are original sin. Now, original sin, when the idea first came up, it was related to having sex, and Augustine was a weirdo about sex, and he knew it, so we're just going to set that aside. It was rehabilitated later by lots of other people, including a 19th century German theologian named Friedrich Schleiermacher. Sin is Original sin is communal brokenness. I was born in original sin. I was born into a world that was almost exclusively white. It would be years before I read a book by a black person, saw a black person on television, saw a black person in the movies or on a magazine, let alone got to know a Hispanic person or a Chinese American. It would be years. I grew up having whiteness mirrored back to me as normal, as just what life is. And so, through no ill will of my own or my parents, I grew up, this was the setting I was in, and it became part of who I am. That I started having biases and prejudices. And then I started doing things that were racist. I started kind of assuming that books written by people of color weren't for me. I started gravitating towards white people, right? I started assigning white people on my syllabi and keeping it going for the next generation. So that communal brokenness is original sin. There are other kinds of original sin, not just racism. I was born in Nitro, West Virginia, the Chemical Valley. I was born at the height of Monsanto's Union Carbide. I don't know, Monsanto's probably only grown since then. They're taking over the universe. But I was born in the Chemical Valley, where in the better living through chemistry age. And that became a part of me, right? I grew up in that air, and my lungs still don't work right. In the same way, I grew up in the air of racism, and the rest of my heart and brain still don't work right. I still have to work at it, not to just repeat what I've been taught. And every time I do a racist action, I do an action that repairs the concrete instead of dismantling it, that's actual sin. So original sin is the communal brokenness. It's the state we find ourselves in. We didn't make this state. We didn't invent this. Nobody here was alive today when race was invented, much less when the concrete of the United States was poured. We find ourselves in this state, and it shapes us, and then we act on it. And that's actual sin. And every act of actual sin contributes to the state of communal brokenness. And so the cycle just keeps going. What do you think about that? Yeah, and I'm a Presbyterian. You are too, as I recall. No. Ah, yeah, this is a big difference here. So you're raised Catholic. So as a Presbyterian, you're always a sinner. And you're not freed from original sin. You're still part of it. Friedrich Schleiermacher says that sin is in each the work of all, and in all the work of each. In each the work of all, and in all the work of each. The language of sin is really good language for talking about missing the mark in ways that are both individual and communal. It talks about brokenness that just becomes the air we breathe in the city that we live in. but then we also contribute to it and keep it going for the next generation. All right, y'all are going to have to talk back to me a little bit more. I know somebody in here has some kind of response to the word sin that you're not sharing with the rest of us. Yes?
Part of my problem with communicating on this issue with, we'll call it my community, is that...
I'm just going to stop you because I'm getting people online who are like, I can't hear the questions.
Oh, great.
So part of my problem with communicating with people in my community that I want to have a discourse on this topic of racism is that so many of them, though we share the same faith background in a way, I can't talk about sin or grace or racism in general without, with the same language, in the same way, in a productive way. It seems like everybody is feels a pressure and a pushback, and so I guess getting back to the jackhammer a little bit, trying to work through that seems insurmountable sometimes.
Yeah.
That isn't really a question. It's just
It's a really good thought, because the thing of it is we've all been taught, many of us have been taught, I shouldn't assume we all have, that we don't want to make other people feel uncomfortable, and that it's better not to talk about race at all, right? Don't talk about race, politics, and religion at the dinner table, right? Those are the three things. Or was it sex, politics, and religion? I don't know. My little seminary, 1 year, we, as a whole community, all the faculty, all the staff, all the students, we read a book called Let's Talk About Race. And at that same year, I had to do an HR online anti-bias training. And I had to pass this test to stay employed. And what it told me was, it is better not to talk about race. We don't talk about it, and we don't have any common language about it. And a lot of folks are really, really eager to make sure that when we talk about racism, we're talking about individual thoughts and feelings and actions. And that's not the point. We could talk about those all day long, and it's beside the point. If right now I could snap my fingers and every white person in America would cease to have biases against people of color, racism would continue just fine, because the concrete would still be there. So I feel you. I also want to say that I often, I'm scared to death I'll say the wrong thing. And it seems like there's a contingent on the right that, I don't mean this theologically, I mean this politically. A contingent on the right who are just annoyed if you talk about racism at all, and a contingent on the left that if you say anything wrong about it, you will be publicly shamed, right? So it's terrifying. I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I do all the time, all the time. And I've been fortunate to have students who will say, do you realize what you just said? And tell me that I've just done something wrong, and I'm grateful for that. But there's also a lot of times when I go home and cry, because these conversations are hard. But I work really hard not to cry while I'm having them, and it matters enough to me that I'll keep trying. So I wish I had anything more to offer.
Hi, my name is Julie, and I guess I want to acknowledge that when we say we, you're talking about white people, because there are a lot of people in this country that talk about race all the time because it has an impact on their daily life, right?
Absolutely.
So I feel like we keep using this we, and it's leaving out many people. That the we is part of the, yeah, we can have that and make the choice not to talk about it, as opposed to this is a part of our everyday reality. So I'm struggling in a good way, I think, with this, like, sin being that constant state of being, and connecting because I do think the sin language is problematic for people outside of faith communities, right? Because it's been used very poorly over time. So I struggle with, like, I think that's a good internal for maybe the people who are here conversation, but I don't know how to sort of cross that gap with folks who don't share that language, or who it's very individualized, right? I think that's part of our being in the United States too. We're very individualized. It's about our personal behavior. That communal behavior is harder for us to grasp. So I think it's good, it's interesting to think about connecting that with these larger, the concrete, I guess, that's been part. So I appreciate that.
No, so remember a second ago when I said I still mess up all the time? Just saying we, even in this room, saying we is problematic, right? Now, as a white theologian, I talk to white Christians a lot. There's very little that I have to teach Christians of color that they don't already know. But I hope, sometimes make a space where white people can talk about race together. And we, white people, have a lot of work to do to get to a point where we can do that well. As for talking outside of Christianity, there are folks who do that really well. And I feel like, but wait, we've got the cool language that already does this. We've got the concepts, right? And innocence and guilt, even if you say, okay, I'm innocent, I don't have to deal with this, or I'm guilty, then you just feel awful. I don't think guilt motivates people to do anything. But if sin, you say, okay, this is a sin that we're part of as white Christians, we know how to respond to that. We practice every week. We confess. And we repent. And the word repent has two parts. First, we confess. We say, oh, we screwed up and this is how. And that seems trivial. But can you imagine what it would do in the United States today if we told the truth about the history I just raced through? We've got people passing laws to make sure we can't tell the truth. We've got people in school board meetings trying to make sure we can't confess. Confession is powerful. And the other part of repentance is to change your direction. So if we think about grace calling us to love God and neighbor, and sin as getting off course, repentance is a course correction. It's working your way back towards who we really are. Penny.
Shannon, I'm kind of intrigued by this whole imagery of the concrete. And Neil, I appreciate your wanting to take a jackhammer to it to get rid of it. We live in a neighborhood that dates back to the late 1920s, and there's only one sidewalk.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of old established trees. And the concrete is always being broken, not from something that falls on it, but something that comes up from underneath. It's this organic movement that breaks this concrete. Now, it's true they come in and rip it out and repair it. But I'm intrigued by this notion of grace as the organic element in breaking through this concrete.
Yeah.
And it literally bottom up.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and you're right. I mean, school boards are the beginning of the fight, because what we teach in schools is what our children learn. So, as a faith community, how can we use this organic element of from the bottom up and God's grace to influence our communities when, on the other hand, I'm very concerned about the separation of church and state?
Yeah, right.
So, comment and question, yes.
So I love that. I'm totally going to steal that, but I will cite you. So if we think about who we really are, we are people destined and called to love God and neighbor in the same way that trees are destined and called to reach up to the sun and down to the soil. And just being who trees are breaks the concrete. And if we just are who we are intended and meant and commanded to be, we could break the concrete up. But we got to learn how to not then say, oh, it's broken, let's fix it. And that's tricky. Okay, we'll come back to the what's next.
There's an example being shown in Lansing now, down in the Knapp's building, downtown Lansing, about the construction of I-496 in Logan Street between Main and St. Joe and the Black community, that it just dismembered. And so we have an example that's on display for the month of October, hopefully into November also, but it's in the 3 windows at Knapp's building downtown Lansing.
Yeah, right. Thank you for mentioning that. And it's also true that in the 60s when they were building highways, you know, they would run them through Black communities, destroy communities so that white people could come in and out of the city to their jobs. We poured the concrete for white people, even when it meant destroying Black communities.
In 1946, I had just seen the movie The Jolson Story. As a 16-year-old, I got captivated by this famous baritone, and I developed a routine impersonating Al Jolson, in which I put on blackface, got on my knees, and sang Mammy. I now have a memoirs published in which I talk about doing that, and I did say I'm somewhat regretful that I did that, but that was the times and no one thought about it then. I have a good friend who is Black, and I'm going to give him a copy of my memoirs, and how should I explain this to him and make sure that he understands that I'm certainly not racist. As a matter of fact, I am a birthright Quaker, and I do believe the Quakers have done more for Blacks over the years than any other denomination, Protestant or Catholic.
Oh, friend, good to meet you. I imagine that your friend will be grateful to receive your memoirs, and that all you would need to say is, there are some things in here I'm not proud of. Now, the Quakers have been a remarkable group. I don't know if you're familiar with the sect of the Religious Society of Friends, but they, from the 1600s, in their beginnings on, they worked against both sexism and racism. So while almost every single denomination in the United States split during the Civil War between the South and the North, the Presbyterians certainly did, the Quakers got, as a group, as a religious sect, they decided to stop enslaving all of their slaves, to release them with money and education. So they were a big part of the Underground Railroad, and they were a huge factor in educating formerly enslaved people. There were Quaker martyrs to the cause of educating formerly enslaved people. But get this, they talk forever. They have meetings upon meetings where they sit in silence and then they talk forever, because they work not quite by consensus, but by the sense of the meeting. So everybody's got to get together. But when it came to releasing enslaved persons, and by the way, they released all the enslaved persons before the Civil War. They were on it, man. They were awesome. But when it came down to those last few holdouts, what they did was they'd send a small group of Quakers to the home of the slaveholder, and they would sit in silence and wait upon the Lord for guidance about whether or not slavery was right. I love that story. That's got to be the most aggressive silence on the planet. We will sit in your living room silently and see what Jesus has to say to you. And the last few holdouts, they excommunicated. They said, you cannot be in communion with us. So there is an incredible history of anti-racist work there. Unfortunately, Quakers did not welcome black people into their worship spaces after the Civil War was over. Now it is the case that Africa is the most Quakers on the planet are found in Africa. But in the time after the Civil War, Quakers who generally sit in silence as a significant portion of their worship, they didn't invite black people to come and sit with them. They were worried. They said, these people sing. They're musical. Now, the best Quaker hymn on the planet, my opinion, is how can you keep from singing? How can I keep from singing? But they were so afraid that black worship was musical that they didn't invite folks in. However, as I said, by every other account, Quakers have been phenomenally ahead of this. There's a fundamental belief that there is that of God in everyone, regardless of gender, race, creed. Sorry, I love the Quakers, so I got on a little sideline there.
So I have a question, right, related to the life of the church as well as the conversation that we're having. It is not an easy thing for Christians to talk about sin. And I've been part of churches where I will get regular notices that they really, the confession of sin is a bit much, can we change it up a little? And because they say it makes them feel bad. To have a confession of sin every Sunday is just a downer. And I feel like those notes tell me I'm not doing my job right because for me, always confession of sin is a two-step with an understanding of grace and forgiveness, right?
Right.
And I somehow think, and maybe this is my question, do you think that the same thing is true about teaching our true history? That it is like the confession of sin without an understanding of grace?
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely.
Right? So you don't want to be left with the thing that makes you feel terrible. You need to be relieved of the burden and open up a new future.
Okay, so here I'm going to make a public confession. I am ridiculously patriotic. I have been, I started knocking on doors, campaigning when I was 12, and I still do it. I still really believe in the ideals behind the United States. I still think they're good. I still think they're gracious. So couldn't we teach? We are about justice and liberty for all. We are about governance by, for, and of the people. This is who we as a nation are called to be. But then we have, in order to course correct, we have to acknowledge when we've gone off course. Now, when I think about this later tonight, I'll probably think that that statement is heretical and I'm being idolatrous about the ideals of the United States. But what if we constantly emphasized what we're aiming for here? And then maybe we could talk about the ways we've missed it. Yes, we got two more comments, questions.
Thank you.
You're saying many disquieting things,
Yes.
and that's good. That's good for us. It's concerning to me when we're talking about school boards and critical race theory and these kinds of things, that many of the people who are involved in those discussions, who are deeply embedded in the concrete, see themselves as faithful Christians with lots of grace. Whereas what they interpret as grace and what we interpret as grace, or what we interpret as sin and they interpret as sin, are very, very different.
Mm-hmm.
What are some ideas or suggestions or strategies that you would have to help us? I don't know if there's anything we can do or not. Maybe it's so embedded in the concrete, but is it possible, do you think? Are we hopeful that conversations and involvement can maybe help us as Christians?
Absolutely. I am hopeful. I am hopeful because y'all are here. You're showing up on a Sunday afternoon when you need a nap and there might be a game on TV and it's a beautiful day outside and you're showing up to hear about race. What in the world that is so hopeful. I fully believe that in white Christian churches all over America, there are people of goodwill who don't like what's happening and who want to make it better. But we don't know how to start. Where do we buy a jackhammer? And we don't know how to have the conversation because we have different things going on. Now, I also believe that there is, I don't work here, so I can say this, and please blame me and not Shawnthea. These are my thoughts. There are a lot of folks who are like the wealthy Europeans against whom Bacon rebelled. They're like, we can keep power as long as we make sure that these little people are fighting against each other. There are a lot of folks making a lot of money off propaganda about critical race theory. There are a lot of people who are making a lot of money selling a brand of Christianity that is white nationalism. And yeah, I just waxed romantic about the United States, and I really do. I believe in democracy. I believe in the idea of having this mad mixture of people all together. But the idea of American exceptionalism, not telling the truth of our past, that is making Christianity serve a false god. And as faithful Christians, we have to tell the truth about that. This is a brother and sister in Christ, but they're worshiping a golden calf. And I have to say that. And I have to be able to say why I believe it, and then be willing to listen to see if I've got it wrong. But people carrying a Confederate flag and a cross going into the Capitol on January 6th, that is idolatry. And we've got a word for that too. And the word is idolatry. We need to be clear about it. The craziest people calling themselves Christian get the microphone. Not in this setting, but in others. So the rest of us have to be willing to speak loud and say, I'm Christian and I think that's crazy. That's hard to do. Penny had a comment.
So Shawnthea knows this about me, and I no longer work here, so I can say this. I have a real problem with the prayer of confession on Sunday morning.
Tell me all about it. I knew some of you were holding out about sin.
And it's not because I don't believe that there isn't sin. And I do believe that it's missing the mark. And I can use all of that good theological language. My issue with the prayer of confession lies in the assurance of pardon. Because it is so often like, no, you've said it now, just believe that God loves you. And to me, that's cheap grace.
Yeah.
And the power of the assurance of pardon is to know for which purpose you have been pardoned. And we're talking about it, and that is to be reminded, not that we are loved, but that we are loved for the purpose of loving God and one another.
I want to come back when you're preaching. Yeah, Calvin, not a theologian I quote often, said we are elected to service. You're not just elected to salvation, you're elected to service.
Exactly.
And that true repentance includes both the verbal confession and the course correction. So this is what I've been hearing from this contingent throughout this, which is like, okay, now what? What do we do? What do we do? Are we ready to move in that direction a little bit? Yeah? I'm going to tell you 6 things in order that I think are the next steps. And you can disagree with all of them. The first thing is to connect. There are already lots of people in Lansing. There are groups that are working on anti-racism. It's already happening. And we have to connect with them. That can be terrifying. Normally, before I talk about these 6 things, I'm going to step back. I ask people to take out a piece of paper and to write down 6 assets that they have. 6. I'm sorry, 10. I said 6 and it just kept going. 10 assets that you have. And I make it 10 because you start off with like, I have a house, I have a car. But by 10, you're like, I have a dining room table, right? 10 places you have access to. Rooms you can walk into and no one questions your presence. So that might be a group you belong to, that you belong to the Historical Society or the Library Board. It might be your book group. It might be the fact that you're well educated and speak with perfect grammar. And so if you put on your Sunday best, you can walk into any courthouse or lawyer's office in the city and no one will question that you're there. Whatever those are, what are your access points in the community? And then 10 abilities. What can you do? Now, again, 10 is important because if you start at the top, it's like, I can teach theology. By the time I get to 10, I'm like, I can make a really good sandwich, you know? So you do all 10. And if you do that individually and as a church, it's fascinating. You've got a lot of assets in this church. You've got a lot of access points in this community. And you've got a lot of abilities here. Who can speak another language? Who's retired and has time in the daytime? Who's got a cell phone? The riches in this church are enormous. But when we want to connect with a group that's already doing the work, especially if we are white, we need to not walk in with the top of our list, right? If I show up at a meeting of Black Lives Matter and say, I'd like to teach theology, I'm not going to get a good reception. If I walk in and say, you know, I'm really good at lecturing, can I lecture you for a while? That's not going to go well. But if I show up and say, you know what, I'm really good at making sandwiches, and I brought the supplies. Anybody hungry? And as you know, there's a whole age range of college students and high school students who are always hungry. Who doesn't want a sandwich? So the first thing is connect with a group that is already doing it, already in the work, who works with recent immigrants, who works with whatever. There are people already doing this work in this town. When we, and here I do mean white people, try and figure this out on our own, what we should do next, we will almost always end up fixing the concrete. In Louisville, several years ago, there was a concerted effort among different activist groups to ban the box. Do you all know what that means? Some of you do, some of you don't. I didn't have a clue, like, what box? Why are we banning it? But on the front page of a lot of applications for employment, there's a box that says, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And if you check that box, you won't get a job. And so people, and given the racism of our judicial system, people of color are so much more likely to go to jail. And when they are released from prison, that box makes it almost impossible to really become a member of society again. Now, if I had sat with my professor friends and thought for a month and a half about what black people in Louisville really needed, I would not have come up with what they really needed was to ban the box. I didn't even know about it. But there are people who do know, and my job is to listen. So you connect with folks already doing the work, because they will know what is needed in this moment, in this time and place. By the way, the box was banned in Louisville, at least among anyone employed by the city, and I think wider than that. Connect. Thank you. Good, because I don't have these in my notes. God bless you. The second is to amplify. There are so many brilliant people of color saying brilliant things, and it's really easy for white Christians to never hear them. One of the things that happens often is that white people will ask questions of their black friends or even black strangers. Can you help me understand? Can you tell me about, well, teaching is labor. And so when we ask a person of color to teach us, we are essentially asking for them to do unpaid labor. And I think it's just damn near in the DNA of white Americans to expect people of color to do unpaid labor for us. We don't mean to, but we do it. But the brilliant thing is the written word. There are so many people of color who've written down the answer to any question we might have, and they've put it in books and movies and articles and podcasts, and we can learn from their voices. I'm a news addict, so I read the news all the time. It's really easy to read the news only written by white people. So who are the journalists? Who are the news commentators who are black, who are Hispanic, who are Asian American? How do I make sure that I'm listening to those voices? And then when I go into those rooms that I have access to, but those folks of color might not, I amplify their voices. You know, always cite them. Well, Michael Harriot wrote this, and I find it really fascinating. You can put voices in places that they would not have access to otherwise. Does that make sense? So a lot of people ask me why educate isn't on this list. And it's not on this list because I think that's the pre-work before you even get started. And because we have a tendency to stay there. I'm just going to keep reading books about this. So connect, amplify, advocate. Thank you. I really thought that was in the notes, and then it's not. Advocacy is the easiest one, and it really works. It's fabulous. You can listen to whatever people you're connected with, and when they say what we need to do is ban the box, then you start calling people, or you start talking to your neighbors. You work for political change. It's awesome. If you got a cell phone, you plug in your Congress people's number, call them every day. Hi, I'm Shannon. Oh, you again? And even if you get some intern, they keep track. And sometimes we flood the lines. We just flood them completely. When there was some time back a move to put professors who were teaching scary things on a website so they could be targeted, instead of hiding, almost every professor signed up. It's like, oh, well, you just made that impossible, didn't you? Figuring out what bills do we want passed, and listening to people of color in that assessment, and calling, sending postcards, trying to get people out to vote, that's advocacy, and it's easy. You can get an appointment with somebody who works in your congressperson's office. Just go in and tell them what you want. Several years ago, I went lobbying with ecumenical advocacy days. So a bunch of Christians, and we went to DC, and we listened to the organizations who told us this is what we want this year. And then we go and we knock on the door and we talk to the congressional offices and tell them what we want. And I was looking around and I was thinking, oh my goodness, we are facing so many problems in this world, and this ragtag group of middle-aged Christians in comfortable shoes, this is our line of defense? Like, we're the one? And then it's like, no. Middle-aged Christians in sensible shoes, they can get a lot done. They can get a lot done. Okay, advocate, that's the easy one. Accompany? Accompany is a particular theological kind of advocacy work, or kind of, and it emerged in the 60s and 70s, dealing with folks in Central and Latin America. When there were, say, Christian pastors who said that Jesus wanted everyone to eat, they would be targeted by militias. And they were often disappeared. You know, when disappear becomes a verb, it's not a good thing. And so folks figured out that a white person with an American passport could amplify the story of what had happened. And so if that Guatemalan or Honduran pastor is El Salvadoran pastor is going to say these radical things like Jesus wants people to be fed, they're less likely to get killed if there's a white American next to them. And so people from the United States would fly down and just spend all their time with that pastor, and then another person would come, and it would keep them alive. It would keep them alive. That's a ministry of presence. That's enormous. So I tell a story about the guardian angels. So under President Barack Obama, there was a lot of push to get immigrant children through the immigration courts really quickly. People called it the rocket docket. And children who came unaccompanied into the United States would be told, this is your court date, you show up, you get a lawyer, here are the lawyers. The list of lawyers is all people who are no longer in business or whatever. The kids don't understand what any of this means. It's a total setup. They come up before the judge, and by and large, the judge sends them out. So a group started by Allison Harrington, I think. No, that's a wrong name. Started by a Presbyterian minister. They all speak Spanish. It's just random Christians in Los Angeles who speak Spanish and are willing to do this. And they put on t-shirts that have angels on them. And the deal is they show up in the courtroom where the immigrant children are going before the judge. They sit in the pews. They're not called pews in a courtroom. Seats, benches. And they're not allowed to speak, but they can be expressive. So they go, they express that they can understand what the judge is saying. They are watching, and they know what's going on. Now, I haven't checked into this recently, but in 2018, that group had been going for 3 years, and not a single child had been sent back when the guardian angels were there. Because just having a person of privilege have their eyes on it mattered. And that still matters today. If you're driving down the road and an African American has been pulled over by a police officer, maybe you should stick around. Where can your presence maybe help? Just to be a person, just accompany someone. All right, accompany, impede. Many of you read Harry Potter? Yeah. The impedimentia curse. I love that. So in the world of wizards and witches, you can cast a spell which just slows someone down. Just makes a minor impediment. There's a lot to be said for impeding injustice. And this is Allison Harrington. So this is the sanctuary movement, is one example of this. That there are lots of times when immigrants to the United States who have a good case, they could probably be allowed to stay. They're deported before their case comes before a judge. And so churches and synagogues and mosques will often provide sanctuary and say, you can stay in our church. Your family can live here. And it's a huge commitment because there has to be a member of the church there 24/7. And sometimes these folks live in a church for 2-3 years. And they only allow folks that they have a pretty good chance that they will be allowed to stay, and they'd be in serious harm if they were sent back to their country of origin. So what the sanctuary process does is it slows down the wheels. Someone isn't going to be deported while they're living in the church. And if you slow it down long enough, the court might have a chance to catch up. Now, we have lots of historical examples of impeding that was more radical than that. There were lots of folks who tried to impede the Nazis. Everyone who hid a Jewish person, everyone who lost a file, everyone who falsified papers, we can look back and say, well done. So we know that impeding injustice can be a very faithful thing to do. Celebrate? Oh, you are so my favorite person today. And the next thing to do is to celebrate. People say, well, faith is the opposite of fear. I think joy is the opposite of fear. And joy matters. And when we celebrate together, we are refusing to stay in our assigned spaces. If we're afraid, people in power can get folks to do almost anything if they're afraid. But if we're joyful, it's different. So one of the examples that I like of this is pride parades. That LGBTQ folks had every reason to be fearful that they would be hurt. And what they did was start a parade where they celebrated, not that we made it through another day, but they celebrated their queerness. Let's celebrate this thing that we're being told is wrong. And that has changed the course of history in this country. Not by itself, but in part. Now, it strikes me, having been in your auditorium, what do we call the room where there's fellowship hall where we had lunch? What's the name of it? The social hall. Y'all could throw a good party. Y'all could throw a really good party. Who needs a good party around here? Who could you throw a party for that would break down the walls meant to divide us? Who could you celebrate with? I suspect y'all would be really good at that. And that, too, is part of the work of social justice. And we are not going to change anything quickly. This concrete is old and it goes deep, but every time you make it crack, you need to stop and celebrate it, to have energy to keep pounding away and make the next crack. Comments? Questions? Yes. Oh.
Yeah, we've had some cracks because of 2014 and the incident in St. Louis with Michael Brown and the Black Lives Matter that came out of that, the George Floyd stuff. And that's been across not only the religious community, but the secular community, and a lot of folks, all sorts of backgrounds have come together. I don't know about Breonna Taylor in the Louisville area, what's happened there as much, but can you comment on those? Is that part of the things that could change? Or what's going on?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. When Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, his body was left uncovered on the street in the August sun for 4 hours and 32 minutes. Now, a lot of white Americans who don't know the history of lynching and know how much the public display of the body was critical to getting out the message, to telling everyone, if you're black, we can kill you with impunity, the we being white people. I'm trying, I'm learning, I appreciate it. So I'm watching that, and I think these police officers are so incompetent. That's just shamefully, they are shamefully bad at their jobs. Black families are watching that and saying they're displaying the body. This is a lynching. This is a lynching. That's what this is. And because we have different histories, different versions of American history in our minds, we can't figure out what this looks like to one another. We can't do it. My son came downstairs, he was 14, and we'd been watching the protests. And there were kids. And he said, Mom, we should go to Ferguson. And I said, I don't know how to help. I don't know what to do. What am I going to do? Show up and make sandwiches? I didn't know yet that I should have. In August, and there were still later in August, there were still nightly protests going on, and these police officers were beating the crap out of teenagers, and there was rubber bullets and tear gas and pepper spray and all of it. There was a call for clergy to come and accompany the protesters, walk with them. And so I went, and I was utterly terrified. And we walked the streets with teenagers, young people, and their organized space was your community, what'd you call it, it was the social hall. And they had some tables set up And one of the tables had like Band-Aids and Neosporin, and one of the tables had like painter's masks and swim goggles, and one of the tables just had milk, because milk helps your eyes if you've been tear gassed. And these young people, I cannot tell you how immeasurably young they were. They showed up and made a space in this church and would go out and they'd put on a painter's mask and have some goggles with them, and they'd go out and face the most heavily armed police I've ever seen in my life. Machine guns, and so many of them. I have never seen faith like that before in my life. They'd ask for clergy to come, and so we met in a parking lot of a grocery store, and by the time there were 3 of us, middle-aged clergy people, there were 6 police cars surrounding us. Before we went out, you had to be in a group, Sharpie the legal aid name on your arm, and you had to decide as a group. We were told you memorize everybody's name, because it's kind of the buddy system, and you had to decide in a group when you'd come back. And I'm like, what do you mean? Like a time? And they're like, no. What weaponry will make you leave? Will you leave when the tear gas starts, or are you going to wait for the rubber bullets? I was terrified. But then there's a teenager. And they say, well, you know, the teenagers will keep going out no matter what. And we just need to be beside them, because the police will treat us differently. And we're walking down the sidewalk, and the police officer would walk and bump someone off the sidewalk and then say, you're off the sidewalk, you need to, I'm arresting you. And you weren't allowed to pause. Never walked so much in my life. If you stopped on the sidewalk, they could arrest you, so you had to keep walking. And we paused, and at that moment, it was me and 2 other white women. And the police officer says to us, I'm sorry, I don't want to have to do this to you, but I need you to keep moving. And it was so telling. I don't have to do this to you. I don't want to do this to you. But if they were going to get arrested, we were going to be there to witness it. I went back in October when they asked for clergy to come again. And we were arrested. They were arresting black teenagers for stepping over an imaginary line. And so, like, okay, you're going to have to arrest the middle-aged white Presbyterian woman who doesn't threaten you at all, because I'll step over the line beside them. And watching how those young folks were treated changed me. Watching how they were treated changed me. When Breonna Taylor was killed in Louisville, I assume that you've heard this story. She was in her apartment, and police used a no-knock warrant and started shooting. Her boyfriend, thinking this was an intruder, shot at one of the police. And Breonna Taylor was killed. Some of the police who were involved in that raid were put up on charges, but only for the bullets that missed. No one was put on charges for killing this young EMT who had no history or anything of doing anything wrong. But they were put on charges for the bullets that went astray in other apartment buildings. And so the black community came out. There's a square not far from where this happened that they call Injustice Square, and they occupied it for over a year. And every single night, the police would come out in force. And they do something called kettling, which is the police circle the protesters and push them into one area. And then they're surrounded, and then they say, this is an unlawful gathering, you need to disperse. But they can't leave, and so they all get arrested. It was fascinating to watch the resilience of this community. They kept going for well over a year. And I went some, everybody went some. And then the Trumpers started showing up. You could see the Trump flags that went with the enormous amount of weaponry. And for some reason, they would wear Hawaiian shirts, which are now like, yeah. And once again, you've got these young black people who were risking their lives to go out and face these heavily armed folks. Heavily armed folks. One church, when the police started getting really bad, there was the week, sorry, I've gone off course. The police announced that the verdict was going to be given at a certain day. And it was given at night, which is, an indication. We are going to make this legal announcement at 8 p.m. Why the heck you doing that? Well, cover of darkness, man. And for 3-4 days before then, Louisville was an occupied city. The streets were closed, there were helicopters constantly, there were National Guards folks. It was a militarized zone. They knew ahead of time, and they decided to announce this in the evening. And I begged some of my friends not to go. Some of the students that I taught who are now black ministers in that community, I'm like, don't go right now. They're looking for footage of someone getting shot. Please don't go tonight. And they said, I gotta go. And when it got really bad, there is a Unitarian church that's got fencing. And they invited everyone in. And the police said, it has to be a worship service. And so they started worshiping. And they kept it up for hours and hours. And meanwhile, they sent out a message to clergy all over Kentucky saying, we can't get these people out. The police are waiting to arrest them. If you've got a clergy collar, come in your car. And so the clergy would hand off this young protester into this car. And then they do it again until they got all those people out. I'm like, oh, that's a jackhammer. That's a jackhammer. And then 2 nights later, sorry, I really will stop soon. By 2-3 nights later, you go up to that church. We went down with water and food, supplies. And there's so much. There's a mountain of bottled water. There is food for 500 people. There's a medic table. There's a hot dog truck. There's music playing. It's a party. They kept it up for over a year, and no-knock laws are not legal in the state of Kentucky anymore, and they've fallen down in lots of other states. And that's a tiny little bit of a crack in the sidewalk that has cost too much, but it's a crack in the concrete, and those people made it happen. I will stop talking now.
I want to thank Shannon for coming and speaking to us, and thank all of you who were online with us. If you have any follow-up questions at any time, let us know. This is part of an ongoing conversation here at the People's Church because we mean to be a force for good in the world. As you have reminded us, we are called to love and serve all we meet. And we've got a lot of people right here on our doorstep who need our love and service. So thank you for coming out to the 5th Annual Larzelere Lecture, and we look forward to seeing you next year. All right, take care.